And I was going to tell you we are going to be recording. I'm a board member and chair of the programming committee, and our president, Denise Pulverine, unfortunately was not able to make it tonight, so I'm filling in for her. And before we get to our panel discussion, just want to cover a few housekeeping items. One is, as you heard, we are recording this so that people who weren't able to tune in tonight will be able to watch it later. And also, hopefully everyone got the save the date email for the Excellence in Journalism Awards. It will be the 43rd annual EIJ award ceremony. And so we're asking that everyone save the date of June 24th. That's a Thursday. And it will be virtual again this year. And of course, we all hope it could be in person, but it's still going to be a great event and a chance to come together and celebrate the best of Ohio journalism. And we have MCs for the evening will be Sam Allard, who's on this call tonight and also a member of the programming committee, and Sia New Yorker of WOIO. So we hope to have a lot of folks join for that. And then as for tonight's program, if anyone has any questions for the panelists, please go ahead and put them in the chat, and I'll be monitoring the chat throughout the evening so that we can get the questions to our moderator and she can ask our panelists. So on the topic of tonight, this, as you probably are all aware, this is the anniversary, the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. And that created, protests around the country and around the world against police brutality, police racism, movements toward police accountability, and then just much broader range of issues. And it also, that and other events as well have led newsrooms around the country to start thinking even more deeply about how do they report crime, what constitutes a credible witness, what details should you include and that sort of thing. So we thought that this would be a really interesting topic to hear from journalists throughout the area about, what are they thinking about and weighing, and have their policies changed? What are they considering? So our moderator is Rachel Polanski, a 3-time Emmy Award, Edward R. Murrow Award winning and Emmy nominated reporter at WKYC 3 News. Recent coverage included an investigative series on the increase in crime in both Cleveland and Akron during the pandemic and community efforts to stop it. She also led the charge on a series of exclusive stories about the COVID-19 outbreak at a federal prison. So I'm going to turn it over to Rachel now, and she will have the pleasure of introducing our panelists. Rachel.
Thank you, Christy. I really appreciate that. When the press club asked me to moderate this event, I was really excited to do it because I think it's a really important topic that needs to be talked about more in our newsrooms. And 2, I'm genuinely curious to hear from other journalists about the policies in their organizations. So first, I'll introduce the panel. We have Marlene Harris-Taylor. She is the managing producer of health content at IdeaStream. She's also on the board for the Press Club. We also have Ron Calhoun, the publisher of the Cleveland Observer, a community-based media platform providing information and resources in an area that has been deemed a news desert in urban Cleveland. We have Trey Modelin. He's the news director and production assistant at WOVU 95.9 FM, Our Voices United, which is a nonprofit community radio station here in Cleveland. And we have Rachel DeSell, who is an independent journalist and part of the Cleveland Documenters team. You're probably all familiar with her work as she reported at the Plain Dealer for 18 years. So that's our panel. And as I go through, I have a number of questions, and to the panelists, feel free, you all can answer, or you all don't have to answer every question. And for those watching, as Christy mentioned, feel free to put questions in the chat, and I'll make sure that I get to those at the end of the presentation. So today is, of course, as Christy said, the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. I think it's important for this discussion that I remind you how Floyd's death was initially reported to the media by police. At the time, the report said, quote, "He was ordered to step from his car. After he got out, he physically resisted officers. Officers were able to get the suspect into handcuffs. Noted he appeared to be suffering medical distress. Officers called an ambulance. He was transported to a hospital where he died a short time later. So all of that is true, sure, but as we know, this isn't the whole story. In our WKYC newsroom, Floyd's murder led to deeper discussions around the topic of crime reporting. I'm sure it did in your newsrooms too. So I'll get right to it with some questions. Yeah, so first up, how do you determine what details to include in your crime stories? For example, when do you include age, race, and gender? I'll give it to you panelists to kick that off.
Do you want anybody in particular to start?
Perfect.
Okay, well, I'll start then, I guess. Well, I just want to start by saying in public media, we're a little bit different than some of the other folks on the panel, because as a rule, we don't cover crime stories every day. You know, we don't cover the latest shooting or the latest whatever in crime. We cover stories when they have a broader implication, or when perhaps there's a series of crimes and there's something larger to say about, like, a series of shootings over the summer or something like that. But in terms of how we decide what to include, we do, like many other newsrooms, rely on the police reports for most of the information in the beginning about what happened at that scene. And we include most details, other than we won't include race, for example, unless there's some reason to include race, like there was some racial implications to the story or something like that. So we do think through what we're going to include, but for the most part, we include what the police have in the police report.
And I'm going to tag on along with Marlene and agree. In the 2 years that we've had our publication, and that's a baby publication based on the rest of you guys, we've only had one crime report, and that was in response to the verdict to the George Floyd case. So we figure you guys are, or the media is producing enough negative content that we want to actually counter it with as much positive content as possible. So we don't focus on crime.
Did anyone else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I'll go. Yeah, we here at WOVU 95.9 FM, Our Voices United, we really do try to collect and report as much information as we can. Sometimes that includes demographics, because we feel the audience still does need to know that. With George Floyd in particular, we would do just weekly updates on the trial, which lasted 3 weeks out in Minneapolis area, end of the week, and we would present details of the case. We would present what the prosecution and what the defense says to kind of balance out, because just like a court of law, both prosecution has a side, defense has a side. So we try to be fair and balanced in that regard.
Rachel, I think, so I can't, of course, speak for any particular publication, but I think one of the things that's important to bring up is that newsrooms actually have these conversations in advance of when they're doing this type of reporting. Have conversations about what details to include, tone, language, context, because all of those things matter. And also, what details to use from police reports, including how it's attributed. Is it stated as if it's a fact? Are you picking up language directly from a police report that is not language that we would use in reporting? So I think those are questions that are good for kind of newsroom-wide conversations, so that when something comes up, and if there are questions about coverage, you can explain to people why you have made the decisions that you've made. And you can also look across your own newsroom to make sure that those things are applied evenly to all demographics that you might cover.
Right. Yeah, and here at WKYC, we're constantly double checking ourselves on that as well. And I think for us, we do it, but it has to be pertinent to the story. So what about you panelists? How do you decide which facts are and are not relevant to report. What about you, Rachel? Put you on the spot.
Okay, I mean, I think it's hard to set one standard for every story. I mean, I think there are some overarching things, but you really have to try to examine every situation. Like I said, I think one of the major things to think about is, if you have a policy, if you have a standard, you have a responsibility to make sure it's applied evenly. And I'll never forget when I was younger, a lot younger, and I reported on the juvenile court. I heard complaints from folks about the ways in which we reported on cases in the Cuyahoga County Juvenile Court that had to do with kids that lived in the city of Cleveland and kids that lived in the suburbs. The same thing for Lorain County, where I also reported. So I had an editor at a time, Susan Goldberg, that said, well, let's dig into it and figure it out. Let's see if these complaints are, accurate. And so we chronicled every story we wrote on a juvenile crime. And, lo and behold, 75% of the time when the crime involved a juvenile who was Black, we would either use their name or use details that we would not have used if it was a white juvenile or a juvenile that lived in the suburbs. And so after seeing that evidence, she just decided, we're not going to name juveniles unless there is a pressing public safety need, like, an active shooter situation or something like that, where, the public was at risk, because, she said, we basically can't trust ourselves to do this the right way and to do it fairly without having a really strict, hold on it. And so I think that kind of applies for a lot of the things that we do, because we know now what we didn't know when I was doing that reporting, a lot more about implicit bias and things that people maybe weren't doing intentionally, but just happened. So I think that's another argument for really thinking about that.
I'll piggyback on what Rachel has said and talk about something that I've seen in newsrooms, because I've worked in other newsrooms, I've worked in public media newsrooms, I've worked for newspapers. One of the things that really has bothered me is the fact that we as journalists, when we tend to report on things that are unusual, right? I mean, that's kind of how we define what's news, right? And so if there's an area of town where there's lots of shootings, at some point we start to report on it as though, oh yeah, there was another shooting in X area of town, right? But if there's an area of town where there's very few shootings, or, say a person is murdered in a suburban area, there tends to be, I think, more attention given to the victims when the person in the suburban area is killed, versus if someone is killed in an area where, say, there's a lot of gang violence in the area or lots of shootings all the time. Because I think the bias in the news media is that because this is a suburban community where it doesn't happen that much, then we really need to find out what's going on. Who was this victim? Who are they? Tell more of their story. Whereas we may not do that to someone who lives in the city, particularly if the victim is Black or Hispanic, or if the victim lives in a low income area.
Yeah, not only that, Marlene, I think if you look at the language attached to those cases, one case that, bothered me recently, and I kind of ran my mouth about it a bit, was a young woman who was killed. And and all these stories said that she was a habitual runaway. That was literally like the only descriptor of her in her life. And that to me is just kind of a disgusting thing, to reduce the life of a child who's going to be a senior in high school to quote unquote a habitual runaway. And this was a child that had a hard life and was in foster care, but she also had a lot of joy and love, and she was funny, and people who loved her, and that really hurt them to see her reduced to that. I had hoped we learned that lesson after the Seoul killings, and the way that we talked about the women in that case, both police and reporters, because this is police that was giving out this information, but it just showed me that we have not learned that lesson yet. And it has not been, really drilled into us enough to step back and ask questions about using those things in stories.
You're a little bit low, Marlene.
Oh, I said, I wonder, Rachel didn't mention it, but I wonder what side of town she was from. It probably wasn't in the affluent suburb, right?
No, she went to Parma High School, but she wasn't originally from Parma. She was in the foster care system. And I also think that kind of gets to another question about context. You know, if you only have 3 paragraphs on someone's life at that moment, and that's what you choose to include, it's different than if you have taken the time to do deeper reporting and talk to people who knew someone. And if you need to include some of that context, then you're doing it from the right point of view.
I hope my mic is a little better there. I tried to turn it up a little bit. I hope that's better.
Rachel, I think context is extremely important because as I'm in the community, I have experienced things as Ron Calhoun, and I look at things and I interpret it the way my experiences have been. And it's the same thing with you. But when you actually have to vet a story, you really have to develop a relationship with this, if nothing else, the story, so that you can actually bring in the right narrative. Because if you're biased by what you call it, explicit bias, if you're biased by your background or by your experience, are you really telling the true story?
I think that's a great question. And that also segues nicely into my next question about relying on police reports, and how has that changed recently, given what we have seen in terms of George Floyd, in terms of police shootings, and the fact that officers might have a different view of what happened than other people involved. You know, so for you all, how much do you rely on police reports?
I don't know. I guess I'll get started on this one. Can you hear me any better, Rachel?
Yes, that's much better.
Great. I don't think a lot has changed in that respect. I think that newsrooms and reporters still rely on police reports. But I think that is the nature. I don't know how you get around that, to be honest, because particularly when a story is just breaking, and I should make a distinction between, you know, sometimes things are just breaking and you just have a little bit of news. And so you go with what you have from the police, excuse us from then doing deeper reporting later on. So in the beginning, you don't have any choice but to use the police report to get the basic facts of what happened. So I don't think that's changed that much in that regard.
I hate to hog it up, but I think that's an excuse. And not to, that's not a reflection of you, Marlene. I just think that what is breaking news now? I mean, come on, that's a 50s mentality. Everything is on the internet. Everything is on the internet.
You then, Ron. if you were a reporter and there was something happening and you go to the scene, where would you get the information? Not from the police.
Well, I think the perfect example was when the kid got shot over on 82nd Street. Because that reporter took the time to talk to the family members and talk to the FBI, we got a clearer understanding of what actually happened. And it's probably going to be some further things done on both sides to the individuals to really resolve the situation. But what I'm saying is that person that reporter took the time to get both sides. And today there is no such thing as.
That's not always available to you as a reporter.
What's the rush?
Many times family members don't want to talk to you. There's not always the FBI there. So what do you do in those circumstances?
It's okay to wait. It doesn't, I mean, I don't think we have that same competitive breaking news today that there used to be in the 50s. Where
I would have to side with Marlene on that one. As a reporter for TV, you don't have a choice. It's get on the air on a certain time and report what you know.
I agree that's the spirit of what journalism is doing right now, but it's all over the internet already. So are you really breaking news? I don't think so.
Again, I'll say for myself, and being a GA reporter and covering scenes, kind of like Marlene said, I would go to the scene and first I would door knock and look for people to tell me something. If I could find the family, I would try and get something from them if they didn't slam the door in my face because they just lost a loved one. And I feel like an awful person already because I just knocked on the door. And then I'll ask the police, and I'll make sure in my stories to say, and this was even well before, you know, circumstances in the present day, you know, police say XYZ, witnesses say XYZ, and if we're lucky to get the family members say XYZ.
Let's keep it for real. The relationship that news media has with the police in this community and in many communities is tainted. They rely on the police to give them information behind the scenes, and so they give them deference. I have been in plenty of situations, whether it's a newsroom I worked in or at a crime scene, where I see, you know, police shoveling news to media that doesn't get questioned, and then family members or witnesses telling media stuff, and they're like, we don't really know whether this is true or not. Maybe we shouldn't report it. Making a judgment on the spot over who is reliable and who is not. I think what has changed is that people in neighborhoods are now recording stuff. So they're like, see, what we were telling you is true all along. And so there actually is more information now, and it's pushing back on police narratives in a way that did not happen before. But it'd be wrong, I think, for any reporters not to acknowledge that we did and do probably still have an imbalanced reliance on police, especially when there's a deadline, and especially when we still feel like there's an urgency. And I do think sometimes there is an urgency if there's a danger that's happening or information that needs to get out. But honestly, when there's hundreds or thousands of shooting in the community every year, not every single one of those is breaking news. And on most news websites, those stories are reduced to man shot on East Side. There is nothing urgent about man shot on East Side using coded language and a police quote. That can wait until you have more information. And that is why folks like Ron are doing what they're doing, because they're like seeing the news spend an outsized portion of its time on man shot on East Side and not anything else in the community. So clearly the resources are there, but only for the types of stories that people want to report sometimes. Not saying that's everybody, but that is kind of a generalization, I think, of what you can see in a community like ours.
I think you're absolutely right about that, Rachel. I agree with everything you just said. There's way too much deference given to police and to their version of the story. But I do think, I mean, I agree with both Rachels here. I agree that reporters, and I'm not making an excuse for reporters. I'm saying that reporters don't get to set the policy. That policy is made back by the station managers, by the news directors, et cetera. And if a reporter is sent to the scene and told to get something, and they've got, 10 minutes on the scene to get it, they get what they can and they go with what they have. But also agreeing, though, that I've seen over the years way too much deference given to police officers. In fact, reporters almost become buddies with the cops, especially if they're on the police beat. And the reason that they do that is because that's in many ways the only way they can get the cops to open up to them, to tell them stories or give them scoops and so forth. So questioning the police version of the story, I agree, is very important. But I don't want to pretend like reporters are not being sent out and being put in a situation where they have to turn something around quickly. And if people on the scene won't talk to them, they have to take the information that they have.
Right. Yeah, these are great points. Go ahead, Trey.
Yeah, I was gonna say here at WOVU, we really do try to get as many sources as we can. Sometimes we'll read some police reports, we'll talk to community activists, political officials, clergy that we work with that come to the studio. So we do try to cast a wide net. We also we have a callback line here at the station that our community, because we average about 65,000 listeners a day on our terrestrial frequency, 120,000 if you include the our streaming on our website wovu.org, as well as our free mobile app. And when our listeners have concerns that they want to address, whether it's something about what we're talking about, or it's something that they heard in the news and that they want us to research and follow up on. For everybody who doesn't know, I'm filling in for Jay today. I work as a production assistant here, and Jay's the general manager. He was supposed to be here. Something came up, so I'm here today. But I'll work with him once we both do our research based on what we find on the internet and from what we talk to with people that can come into the station. We'll come together, decide what's most important, what our community needs to know, and we'll go out and make a story about it. So whether it's, like I said, whether it's clergy, political activists, or even some police reports, we try to be fair to everybody.
It's really not fair for us to lump all media together, which I know that's a really easy target and really easy for people to do. But there's different kinds of media. I mean, if you're working for a daily website, or daily publication or a TV news station where you're giving updates 3-4 times a day, that's different than if you're producing, say, a weekly show for a radio station, or if you're doing an in-depth investigation. It's different. So there's different kinds of media, and we should acknowledge that.
Right. And I think too, I'm so happy that I'm an investigative reporter now, because I don't have to deal with those deadlines and going and having to say things on the scene on these crazy deadlines, where you don't feel comfortable, that you haven't gotten all your sources, and you're just kind of talking. And I think as journalists, it's our job to question. So we can't take what the police say as gospel, and we have to determine the reliability of sources. So that's another question for you all. How do you determine the reliability of sources, be it police, be it witnesses, be it family members? How do you do that? Marlene, why don't you start that off?
Well, I think that Rachel made a great point a little bit earlier, that often when reporters or people in the media are talking to non-officials, if they're not talking to police or fire or somebody who's in an official capacity, there's a little more skepticism brought to judging whether that person is telling you the truth or giving you the whole story, versus if you're talking to the mayor or somebody at City Hall or somebody in the police station or somebody at the fire station. So I do think that there needs to be a lot more rigor brought to questioning those folks. But I think it's like anything else in life. I mean, reporters are taught to be skeptical by nature. And I think that they listen to what the person says. If the person contradicts themselves, if what they're telling you verbally contradicts what's written down, that's something that'll raise your eyebrow. We pay attention to nonverbal cues that people are giving us to try to determine whether somebody's being honest with us.
I'm going to break it down into 4 things: trust, transparency, facts, and feelings. So if I'm looking at a story that has to do with crime or criminal justice, the first thing is understanding whether I'm in a place where someone can have trust with me or build trust with me, whether that's because they know me or I'm with someone who they trust, or we have a trusted kind of conduit or connector. How transparent can I be with the person that I'm talking to about what I'm doing and what I will do with the information that they're sharing with me, where it will appear, how it will appear, in what context? Do they have any questions for me? I think when you start with those 2 things, you often get better answers than if you just kind of come at folks with a bunch of questions about something they just witnessed. Even if you're in a hurry, if you can slow down a little bit, slow your pace. And then facts and feelings, really separating with folks, what is a fact? What is a thing that you witnessed, or how do you know it? Other, deeper questions on that. And when some of those things are uncertain, really talking about feelings, like how do you feel about what you saw? Because I think that separating those things with people is helpful, because during a traumatic event, we can really kind of conflate those, because our cortisol is all up and we're often kind of agitated. So when you slow down, you can go through those in a way that someone doesn't feel like you are telegraphing that you don't trust what they're saying, because you're being clear. Okay, I want to know, so did you see this, or did someone tell you that they saw this and it was pretty upsetting? okay, you did see this. All right, tell me what you were feeling as you saw this transpire. Because that's something that I think it's harder for someone to contradict. And so I feel like it's just as important to report that stuff while we're sorting out the other stuff.
Do you want to add anything, Ron?
Yeah, that first bullet point, trust. I think that is the key, but I also think that is the obstacle for journalism in general. Uh, we have uh, we have dug a hole here, and frankly, the only way that we're going to get out of this hole is to regain that trust with the community. And I think that once we do that, it'll make our job even easier.
And I think to that point, you have to be a person first and a reporter second. And that's something like you just learn as you've been in the business. When I first started, I didn't know what I was doing. As you continue, learning and growing, I think that one step at a time there. So we have a question in the chat. Paul said, I'm brand new to journalism. I'm not a reporter, but I was wondering, how can media organizations work to improve their relationship with minority communities? How can media organizations gain the trust of the community after centuries of being buddy-buddy with the cops and prejudiced institutions?
That segued right into my Rachel's point about trust, isn't it? I think the cornerstone of that is the relationship building. Organizations have to very intentionally build relationships back with the community. It's like any relationship that's been hurt or destroyed or broken. You have to rebuild that relationship. So it's going to be a one-on-one. Maybe a reporter has to learn the community, learn the voices in the community. And then once he gains that trust, now we can get back to what journalism really is about.
I mean, I think that one of the things we've all talked about, I know a lot of people on this call have been part of the conversations, is that, our newsrooms don't reflect the community. When your newsrooms don't reflect the community, you're already starting behind, because people will look at your staff or your reporters and say, well, I don't see anybody who looks like me, so you might not value me. And so I think for us, it's both a long and a short-term thing. The short-term thing is doing those things that we've all been talking about to gain trust, but then also putting just as much energy into making sure that we are building pipelines so that the newsrooms do reflect that. And I mean, Ron, I know you're doing workshops in the community. Cleveland Documenters, that's really at the core of the mission, is to, train and pay residents who don't have to have a journalism degree to start to learn how to get information and how to share it. And some of them have, I had my own doubts of how that would go, but I really see the difference in someone coming from a community perspective at what they ask questions about and actually what they care about, which I think can help with coverage. So I think those are two things that we can all do, more to work on.
I'd like to amplify both of those points that Ron and Rachel just made. I think that Ron is right. I think we have, as a media as a whole, has dug a hole with the community, and it is going to take real work to come back. I think one of the difficulties is that, again, people see media as a monolith. They don't see media as individual organizations. Because I know that at IdeaStream, we do a lot of work to try to bring the community into projects that we work on, make sure the community voices are a part of what we do. We have a community engagement specialist that we hired for the health team to do just that, to help expedite the work that we're doing in the community. But when people see a news media person coming, they don't always see, oh, that's IdeaStream, so they're going to be different. Or that's, the documenters, or they're going to be different necessarily. They see the news media as this one big group. And whatever this other person over here in the news media did that they felt was biased or wrong, that gets tainted onto all people in news media. But I also definitely agree with the point that we have to bring more true diversity into our newsroom ranks. And that includes editors like myself, managers. It's not enough to have a diverse workforce in your reporter ranks, because as I said before, they don't always get to make some of the key decisions. So it's important for newsrooms to be diverse from top to bottom.
And I'd also say more training would help. You know, we often, if you haven't been a crime reporter or a criminal justice reporter, if you hadn't written a story about the need for more training, but it's often police that we're talking about. And I sometimes do like training for, you know, law enforcement and criminal justice folks. And the first thing I tell them is like, you guys think you don't get enough training? We have almost zero training sometimes when we come into newsrooms. They're just like, here's a police scanner, run towards whatever is dangerous. There is not a good training or discussion on the way in which you should act, how you should approach people, trauma, how other people might act when they see you, you know, the right times. That is all kind of on the job learning. And really a lot of it depends. If you have a good mentor, you might pick up good habits. If you don't, you might not. Does that sound familiar? Same as law enforcement. So I think we need to look at it when we do stories like that and say, well, what are we doing to make sure that our folks have that proper training and have had those discussions before we put them in these situations?
Definitely. Did you want to add anything, Trey?
Well, for us, in terms of, you know, it comes back to our talkback line when it comes to trying to put out information that helps represent our community. You know, during our live shows, we'll plug in liners during the break. Hey, if you have something to say about what we're talking about, or if you want to just call the office, let us know that of an issue that's going on that you think is pertinent, that you think should be shared with the audience of 65,000 plus. You know, hey, give us a call. You know, leave a voicemail. You know, that way, like I said, we can go and investigate, do our research, and then Jay and I will sit together and you know, put together the best report that we can, which with all pertinent information for the community.
If I can just chime in here, that is our platform's biggest obstacle right now is community engagement. And you would think a Black face in the Black community, been living in the Black community for a long time, I could walk up to just about anybody and they would just pour their guts out. That does not happen. In fact, I was in Dave's and I was checking the rack where we put our papers, and the lady recognized me because I had a Cleveland Observer t-shirt on, and she made this comment that blew me away. She says, "Oh, another liar." And I went, she doesn't even know me. So you're right, Marlene. They clump us all in this box and say they're all bad, keep them away. So we even have that challenge of trying to build trust in the community. And you would think after 2 years we wouldn't, and I'm just wondering, do you still have that obstacle in front of you of building that trust? Of course, Rachel doesn't.
Rachel's a superstar, of course.
Well, I think everybody does. I mean, everybody does. And you have to meet every person at square one. You know, even if someone thinks they know who you are, you know, each story is their own story that you're trying to work on. And you just have to start there with them. I mean, that's it. And again, I'm just going to say, I think pace is really important. Rushing people, especially during stories that have to do with trauma, is always the wrong choice. There's always a more important story, a more full story about something like that to be told if you're willing to be patient and not put someone in the position where they're on the spot.
Let me challenge you a bit there, Rachel, because I mean, it's not that I'm disagreeing with you at all. I'm agreeing with everything that you're saying. But I don't think that you're in the position of a person who their news director has sent them to the scene and says, bring me something back in 10 minutes.
I have been, though. And when I was a younger reporter, I think I did have to deal with that and learn the hard way when people would call and not be happy with something. So then
how did you deal with that at the time?
Yeah, I mean, so for me, I always like the other Rachel said, be human first. But I can even remember literally on the day that Amanda Berry and Gina DeJesus escaped, being ordered to do something and to report some information at that moment. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm not doing that. And if you want to suspend me or you want to do whatever you need to do, go ahead. But this isn't the time to do this. And I'm not going to do it. So, I mean, that you have to kind of have that, I think you have to have guts to do that. And I know that it's way different in TV. And I feel bad for folks that have to deal with that. But that personally for me would just be a gut check of, is this the job for me?
That was so brave of you to do that. I'm not diminishing what you did, because I applaud you for that. I think that's fantastic that you took that stand. But I think depending on where you work, they would have been, some places would have been like, fine, there's the door, goodbye. And then they would have sent the next person out there. So I think that you're right. I think we need to slow down. And again, I'm lucky, and we're lucky in public media that we don't cover the daily crime story. So we're not put in this position a lot. And public media overall has a better trust factor with the public than some other media organizations, even though they do clump us all together year after year when they do surveys about who you trust in the media. Public television, public media is usually at the top of the list. And so we are lucky in that respect that we do have some trust, because people feel like we play it down the middle. But at the same time, anybody who you come and you're sticking a mic in their face when they're in the middle of a trauma, or you're trying to get information from them when they're in the middle of a trauma, is going to have that sort of reflexive reaction to you. And yes, you absolutely have to be human. And I think all good reporters learn over time that you have to be a human being first, and you treat people like they're human and treat everybody with respect. And that gets you a long way. But you're still going to run into those situations like Ron, where the person is like, you media liar. I mean, that's part of the environment that we're dealing with right now.
Yeah, and to piggyback off of that, Marlene, I get all the time, oh, you're with NBC News, fake news. They don't understand the difference between local affiliates either. They clump us all together. They think Lester Holt is back at the station. So that's another thing. And I try, in that respect, I really do try to educate. And I mean, obviously with online trolls, there's no point. And even with people, sometimes there's no point, but I try. I'm like, no, I'm not fake news. I'm one of you. I live in the community. I go to the gym. I'm here because I want to talk to you and I want to know more. And does that always work? No. People that hate us, but sometimes people are like, oh, I didn't realize that. So it's a tough balance.
But Lester Holt was just back at the station, wasn't he?
I know that was a bad example. That was a really bad example. But typically, and it looks like we're getting a couple questions in the chat here. So I'm gonna just, unless anybody wanted to add on to that, I want to get in these questions, and I still have some of my own too. So this one, have the panelists ever gotten pushback from police for the way that they report crime, or being skeptical of the police version of events? How did they handle that? Or were they afraid the police would freeze them out?
That's a really good question. I personally have not had to deal with that, but I do know that it is a thing, that police will absolutely freeze journalists out if they don't like the way that they cover a story. And that's one of the reasons that reporters try to build a relationship with police. But when you're on a beat, even if you're on the health beat, you try to build a relationship with anybody that you interact with on a regular basis. So that's part of what you do as a reporter. But yes, I have seen police freeze people out, and I don't know what that means.
And if they're doing that, and you don't want them to be their source, then they're probably like lying to you anyways. So find another police source who's more honest. I mean, police are just like any other human. You have to assess them and build a relationship. I have police sources that I would trust completely from knowing them for 20 years, and other ones who, that you are getting a differently sided version, of a story. And you just have to know that. And they have to also know that you're going to be willing to fact check them and willing to walk away from things. And I think even folks who you disagree with, if you do your job right, they will still respect you. I can think right now of a police officer that I wrote a story about that was on the front page of the paper that very much upset him and upset his family. And we had a tough conversation before the story ran. And I said, hey, I'm giving you, you got a couple hours here to tell your wife about this. And then, but the story is going to run and, you can respond. And he said, but if I respond, I could get disciplined because the city has a policy that says we can't respond. And I was like, I'm really sorry. That's a tough situation, but I'll say that in the story so that people know, and I'll include some other information. And, I thought that person would never talk to me again. And, almost 10 years later, they still send me information all the time because they didn't like what was printed, but it was fair and it was accurate. So, and it had the nuance that it wouldn't have had I not talked to them, even though they couldn't be quoted.
There's a question in the chat about mugshots. I actually had my own here, so I'm gonna just scroll down to that and then I'll come back to it because I think this is an interesting topic too, and I want us to cover it. Looking at LGBTQ and crime, there were two offending stories in a local newspaper a few years back about a transgender who identified as a woman. Both used a mugshot of the victim who was killed instead of the readily available photos that were used by gay and transgender blogs. While it's standard to use a mugshot if a person is guilty of something, it's not when they're a murder victim, which was the case here. So what do we need to do better when it comes to understanding the unique challenges of LGBTQ victims, and then the thoughts on the mugshots, again, for our panelists?
Don't do that. That's a pretty simple answer. Don't ever do that. Don't ever run someone's mugshot if they were killed. That's horrible. If it was one of your family members, how would you feel? It's just not appropriate. I don't know what else there is to say about that, but also the media has done a terrible job in reporting on transgender deaths in the community. They do a story or two, they use dead names, they don't talk to families, they don't try to assess how many transgender individuals are being killed, and they often don't talk about what their lives were like. And of course, that's not everybody. Some people do a really good job, but overall, it's not something that we do a good job with, and we need to do a better job.
Scott asks, should mugshots be eliminated because they can undermine the presumption of innocence and perpetuate racial stereotypes? Your mic is a little wonky again, Marlene.
Oh, sorry. I'll get a little closer. Is that better?
Mm-hmm. That's better.
Okay. I think the mugshots should definitely be scrutinized a lot more than they are by media organizations. I don't know if you can get rid of them completely, though, to be honest, because there is that, sometimes we call it feeding the beast, right? Sometimes there is that need to have that picture of a person. So if the mugshot is the only available picture of a person who's committed or alleged to commit a crime, then news organizations are most likely going to use it. But I definitely agree, you should never use a mugshot for a murder victim. I don't understand why that would even happen. So I think that it's one of these things that we've got to work through, that I think the news organizations really need to be held accountable for, because I think we've done a terrible job with that.
What? Sorry.
Ron, I think you were going to say something there.
Oh, I was just going to agree. I don't think a mugshot is appropriate, definitely for a murder victim. But I don't think it's, I mean, I wouldn't want my reporters to use that as an excuse I didn't have anything better. I would rather run the story without a picture than to give that perception that that person is guilty. I think that should be a great reporter that worked with me over the past year said, you've got to give both sides of the story to make it fair. And if a picture is going to bias that story, then you probably should not publish that picture.
Right. And I think as a reporter, like that would be a case where you could challenge your manager or a news director. Again, when I first started out, I was way too scared to do that, fear of getting fired. But now, like the other Rachel said, you can say no, you can express feedback, and they will listen, especially if it's a good question or if it's good feedback.
Particularly being in television, because when I was answering before, I was really thinking about TV and websites. In TV in particular, once that picture, once that photo, so do you think that overall TV stations, if the mugshot is the only thing they have, that they would go with no picture at all?
No, to be realistic, no, I wouldn't believe they would go without a picture at all. But if you want to be trusted, if you want people to, I mean, I know it's all about ratings in TV. Okay, I get that, and maybe that's the wrong model. Maybe public media is the vehicle for the community, for residents, for people to really get the story. And I think that it eventually, just like the lack of trust has bit journalism in the butt, at some point that's going to bite them, and it could eventually, be detrimental to journalism, true journalism.
Well, ignoring a large segment of your audience is always detrimental. But I think also, Cleveland.com deserves some props for its Right to Be Forgotten program, where people can ask that stories that are out of date, that have, facts in them that are harming their, future job prospects, be taken down. And I don't know kind of the inner workings of all the decisions. I know that it's been written a lot about, but as long as that is applied evenly and promoted evenly in all communities, I think that's like a good measure towards at least ameliorating some of that harm that was done from, the point in time where it was just all crime, all mugshots. And you can't take it all back, but I think it's a good faith effort to work on that.
Cleveland.com recently said it will no longer include if a rape victim was inebriated. WKYC also does not report whether or not a person was drunk when he or she was raped. What are your views and your organization's views on this?
Well, I'll speak for Idea Stream. We definitely would not do that for Idea Stream. Again, we're at an advantage in that we don't tend to report on daily crimes. But if we were doing a larger story, if there was some reason, to add context, if there was some challenge from, say, the person who was being accused of being raped or something, that item needed to be in the story because it was providing context, we'd talk about it. But as a rule, we would not do that.
Yeah, the Cleveland Observer is an encouraging platform. So again, and I stated this earlier, we don't focus in on the negative. And although, as Rachel said earlier, this is just going to be a blob on the national level, international level, it's not in our vision or our mission to continually bombard the community with negative reporting. And that idea would be negative reporting. And if I have a reporter that wants to go down that road, I would encourage them not to.
I think I agree with Marlene. Like, it's very hard to have ironclad policies on things, because a crime blotter story where you just say something happened and you did not do any reporting is different than a story with context and nuance, and then you have an understanding of how those details matter. I've written plenty of stories where, a perpetrator specifically targeted people who had been in bars or who were drinking for that reason. But if it's a story about that type of perpetration and you are talking to people about it and they understand the context, I think it's different to do that than if you literally are plucking a bunch of words from the police report, blowing them onto your page and walking away. That's when people get upset, because you haven't taken the care to check in with them or with others. And I know people say, oh, you can't get a hold of sexual assault victim or whatever. I don't know. I got a hold of plenty of sexual assault victims who I never quoted in a story, who I just called and said, hey, this is who I am. This story is going to be published. You don't have to be part of the story. I want you to know what facts could be included so that you're not surprised by it, even if it's not something that you want. It's going to be reported everywhere. So it's good for you to know when you see it. And that often was a better way for someone to feel comfortable later on down the road talking about what details. And a lot of those times when I would call folks, they would say, well, that's not even right. Those details aren't even what I said, or that's not even. And at some point I figured out there's so many fact errors in a lot of those initial police reports that they are a little iffy to rely on, especially in those situations.
Yeah, here at WOVU, of course, we will stand up for women and men that are victims of rape. We will also stand up for women and men that are victims of assault. And so, when Jay and I sit down and we talk about a story that we're going to write up and report on over the airwaves, we want to make sure that we don't, like Rachel said, not just throwing out words just to throw out words, making sure that they're actually relevant. Because if we have one story involving a victim of rape versus a victim of assault, murder, you name it, robbery, we want to make sure that we don't, accidentally make it sound like the person who got raped or assaulted, murdered, that it wasn't something that they did, that we don't want to imply that they had it coming or anything. That's not okay. Whatever we can do to send the message that a victim is a victim, whatever happened, if including something would may cloud that judgment for our audience and take away from the fact that somebody got attacked and somebody's rights were violated, then we're not going to report it. Now, again, if it's the centerpiece of the story, then okay, that's one thing. But if we can avoid mentioning it and we can still focus on the fact that somebody was a victim of something, a very serious crime, then that's what we'll go by.
And also, to be clear, we don't want to convict people in a 3-paragraph story when we don't know what happened. But I always, when I was teaching, I always tell people, like, are you ever going to write, the alleged robbery victim was intoxicated? Probably not, right? So then why would you do it in another story? Or if you were writing up your police blotter, would you say the alleged bicycle theft victim? No, probably not. So you don't need to use it in this other context. And I think that's also good, like teaching, training, having that conversation ahead of time.
So we are out of time, but there are still some questions in the chat. Panelists, are you okay staying a few extra minutes to answer some of these questions? Okay. So I'm just going to move on here unless anybody really wants to talk about anything else. So online comments, when they existed on cleveland.com, were particularly racist and harsh as it related to crime in Cleveland. What do you all believe this type of reaction says about the audience for and the value of day-to-day crime coverage?
I've what is that? Oh, go ahead, Marlene. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say racist comments can pop up in stories that are not crime stories. I mean, you cannot control people's thinking and what they're going to say. I mean, we recently had a story on our Facebook feed about the mental health of the Cleveland community, African Americans in the Cleveland community will be impacted for quite a while from the George Floyd murder. And nearly every comment on that story was a racist comment. So you cannot control what people are going to say other than just not to allow comments. It's the only way you can control it.
I was just going to say that interestingly enough, that these comments give you an insight on the audience. And to be frankly honest with you, I was naive. I didn't realize that half of America, and I'm being facetious now, but has this mentality that I don't want to believe they have. And so it's a certain amount of information or reporting just in those comments. Now, would I allow them? We filter our comments. We don't allow certain comments to come out on our publication. So and that's based on what we've heard responses from other articles. I don't think it gives any credence to the particular article, but it does give you an insight on the audience.
Sure. And this will be the last question, and then we'll have to wrap up here. From Paul, in general, how does reporting on white collar crime and government corruption go? Are these investigations also heavily reliant on police and FBI reports? And is there often a focus on the people hurt by the corruption? And then to go off of that, how does this differ from reporting on the other types of crime that we've covered?
I don't know if anybody's noticed, but there's not a lot of corruption reporting going on in Cleveland. I think that's intentional. I'm even afraid to walk down that path as a publication because of the consequences, because of the fear of how it would affect the people that you get the information from. And that's another barrier within trust that we need to conquer as journalists, because as we all know, journalism has neutralized those kind of bad activities. And if we're afraid to report, how do we neutralize it?
I think the questions kind of answer themselves, that we're asked. I mean, clearly when you see reporting on violent crime or, what we call like gang violence, you don't see the same full picture painted of people involved as you do of folks who are pleading for leniency after they have, ripped off the taxpayers. And I think corruption reporting often is very hard-nosed at the outset, but then gets softer as you go along. And there are always some people that think you deserve, and I've actually heard really interesting perspectives on this from folks, that are against incarceration kind of in general, that have said, I'm not gonna say that a young kid that, made a mistake early in life and was a part of a shooting should be in prison. I'm also not going to say someone who committed a white collar crime should be in prison. So I think there's a more nuanced view from the people. But the one thing in that question that I think is really on point is there often, whether it be white collar crime or whether it be violent crime, is not enough focus on the people hurt. The people who are truly, truly damaged by either of those, because it's the hardest type of reporting to do and to sustain, because the damage is often not fully even seen for years.
Right. All right. Well, Rachel, Ron, Marlene, and Trey, thank you guys so much. This was a really thought-provoking, interesting panel, and thank you guys for doing this. I know we're running a couple minutes late here, so I'm going to toss it back to Christy, and thank you for letting me moderate.
Oh, thank you so much, Rachel, and to all the panelists. This has been so fascinating, and I feel like there's so much more that we could talk about. So maybe we'll have to have something similar, 6 months from now or something, because I loved how diverse the topics were. And thank you so much for sharing your insights. We really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody for joining.
Thank you.